So, imagine you are just lying on your couch at the end of a long day, right? You're aimlessly scrolling through your phone.
Right, the usual evening routine.
Yeah, exactly. Just, swiping through the usual mix of dating advice, relationship trends, maybe a little bit of pop psychology about spotting red flags in your partner.
Oh yeah, the algorithm loves feeding us that stuff.
It really does. But then you stumble onto this phrase that at first glance sounds like a breath of fresh air. I mean, it evokes the feeling of like a wellness retreat or maybe a high-end Swiss ski resort.
Right, it sounds very aesthetic, very clean.
Yes. But as you watch the video attached to it,
Yeah.
the bottom just completely drops out.
Yeah.
You realize this catchy, aesthetically pleasing phrase isn't about, finding yourself in the mountains.
No, it's much darker than that.
It is a literal matter of life and death. The phrase we're talking about is the Alpine divorce.
Yeah, and that abrupt tonal shift you just described, that is such a hallmark of how we consume information online right now. You are presented with the language of self-care and relationship boundaries, only to find that it's masking a scenario of extreme physical danger.
Which brings us to our mission for today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today, we are pulling apart a stack of research that traces this seemingly quirky internet buzzword.
Right. We're going to track how a concept born in, of all things, 19th century Gothic fiction morphed into a viral social media trend.
Yeah, and then ultimately manifested in terrifying real-world true crime cases.
It is wild. And really, we're going to explore the dangerous ways the internet, sugarcoats abuse.
Right. So grab a coffee, settle in, because we're balancing some weird literary history with modern internet culture today.
Right.
And it will definitely keep you on the edge of your seat.
To start unpacking this, we really need to look at the psychological friction embedded in those two words. Like the phrase Alpine divorce.
Yeah, let's break that down.
Because it's a profound example of cognitive dissonance, really. The word alpine triggers a very specific sensory response for most people.
Right, like pristine nature, crisp mountain air, elevation, clarity.
Exactly. And then you pair that with divorce.
Which is, obviously emotionally heavy, but fundamentally it's just an administrative thing. It's a legal process. A parting of ways.
Right. But our source material points out that combining those two words creates this deeply sinister Trojan horse.
The Trojan horse, yeah. That's a great way to describe it.
It's this benign, almost pretty exterior that is basically smuggling something violently destructive into everyday conversation.
Because what the phrase Alpine divorce is actually being used to describe, it's a scenario where one partner abandons the other during a remote hike.
Right.
And usually, according to the data and the sources we're looking at, it's a man abandoning a woman.
Yeah, and the reasons vary, right? Sometimes it's after some petty argument on the trail, or sometimes it's literally just because she fell behind and couldn't keep up.
And the euphemism does an incredible amount of heavy lifting there to sanitize the act. And it makes it sound like a mutual, if dramatic, uncoupling in a beautiful setting.
But it's not a breakup. Leaving someone alone in a hostile, remote wilderness environment is exposing them to the elements.
Exactly. The sources make this analogy that I thought was really striking. They say it's akin to real-life ghosting.
Oh, right. The ghosting analogy.
Yeah, but, ghosting normally just means someone stopped texting you back. This is someone walking away while you are miles and miles from civilization.
Potentially without a map, without shelter, without water.
Right. So much more dangerous. So why are we using this language?
Well, that brings us to the mechanism of why this is thriving online. We live in an era of what they call algo-speak.
Algo-speak.
Right, yeah. Users know that if they use terms like murder or abandonment or lethal, the platform's safety filters are going to catch it.
They'll suppress the video, demonetize it, flag it.
Exactly, but divorce, that bypasses those filters effortlessly. The algorithm just sees a relationship term and pushes it straight to the dating advice feeds.
Wow. So it completely misses the fact that the users are actually discussing physical survival.
Right. The algorithm itself is actively participating in the sugarcoating of abuse.
That is wild. And the danger, as our sources point out, is that the term isn't just being used to describe passive abandonment anymore, right?
No, it's escalating.
Yeah, it is increasingly being used to describe deliberate physical harm. Like we are talking about the darkest implication here, someone actively pushing their partner off a steep drop.
And the terminology totally masks that lethality. It takes a potentially fatal act of domestic violence and reduces it to a trendy buzzword.
A buzzword you might just scroll past, sandwiched between a video about sourdough starters, and a makeup tutorial.
Exactly. And when we use the language of breakups to describe attempted homicide, I mean, we fundamentally alter how the public perceives the severity of the act.
It totally warps reality. And, while this entire phenomenon feels like a uniquely modern byproduct of TikTok, the origins of this anxiety actually predate the internet by over a century.
This is the literary connection, which is just fascinating.
Yeah. The concept traces back to an 1893 short story by a Victorian writer named Robert Barr.
Right, and the premise of Barr's story taps into the exact same fears we are seeing surface on social media right now.
Tell us about the plot of this story, because it's pretty crazy.
So it centers on an unhappy married couple traveling through the Alps. The husband decides he wants out of the marriage, but rather than pursue an actual divorce.
Which was probably tough back in 1893 anyway.
Exactly. So he plots to take his wife on a really remote hike and just, push her off a mountain.
Because the environment is the perfect weapon. There are no witnesses, the terrain is treacherous, and a fatal push can so easily be explained away.
Right, just a tragic slip on some loose rocks.
Oh, she tripped.
Yeah.
Right. But the resolution of Barr's story is what makes it so amazing. I loved reading this part. The wife actually notices the changes in his behavior, and she figures out his plan.
She does. And instead of just fleeing, she orchestrates this massive preemptive framing of her husband.
Yes. She leaves letters behind, ensuring he will be blamed for her murder. And then out on the trail, she willingly jumps to her own death.
Just to ensure he is convicted and executed.
I mean, talk about a plot twist.
It's a narrative of mutually assured destruction. The story weaponizes the isolation of the landscape, It takes that vulnerability of relying entirely on your partner in a dangerous setting and turns it into a thriller.
It does. But, okay, I have to push back on the direct lineage here a little bit.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, I struggle to believe that a massive wave of social media users in 2026 are actively reading obscure 1893 Robert Barr short stories.
Oh, right. No, definitely not.
Like, they didn't just collectively decide to make a trend out of Victorian literature. This feels more like convergent evolution, right?
Yes.
Like, did the internet dust off a 130-year-old literary plot device, or did they just independently invent a new term for a very old fear?
It is almost certainly the latter, which honestly is far more interesting from a sociological standpoint. The specific literary narrative, the vengeful Victorian wife and the plotting husband, that faded away. What survived in the cultural ether was the core anxiety.
That primal fear of off-the-grid vulnerability.
Exactly. Over decades, that fear shed its specific fictional roots and evolved into a linguistic shorthand. The modern internet didn't read Robert Barr. They just arrived at the exact same dark conclusion.
Because the mechanics of human trust and physical isolation really haven't changed?
No, they haven't.
Okay, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
So it transitioned from a highly plotted Victorian revenge story into a generalized metaphor for, the ultimate betrayal of trust.
Right.
But a vague cultural fear is one thing. How did it explode into a viral mainstream sensation?
Yeah.
Because the sources point to a highly specific catalyst for this.
Yeah, in February of 2026.
Right. And it didn't start with a true crime documentary. It started with a seemingly standard, albeit distressing, dating video on TikTok.
By a user named @everafteraya.
Yeah.
That video is really the inflection point where the abstract fear met undeniable visual proof.
And the visual of that video is so striking. I mean, she films herself entirely alone on this desolate Rocky Mountain trail.
You can actually hear the wind whipping against the microphone.
Yeah, the audio is intense. And she is visibly distressed, physically exhausted, and she claims the person she was hiking with had just walked off and abandoned her.
The contrast in that imagery is what makes it so arresting, I think. You have this modern woman, she's likely dressed in standard athletic wear, holding a smartphone.
Right, all these symbols of modern connectivity and safety.
And exactly, juxtaposed against this unforgiving ancient landscape where, honestly, a twisted ankle or a sudden drop in temperature can be fatal.
And the caption she put over that raw footage is what really ignited the algorithm. She wrote, and I'm quoting here, POV. You go on a hike with him in the mountains, but he leaves you alone, and you realize he never liked you to begin with.
It's brilliant in a dark way. Look at the psychological bridge she builds in that single sentence.
Yeah, unpack that for us.
Well, you realize he never liked you to begin with? That is a universal, mundane dating anxiety.
Right. It's the realization you have when someone, ghosts your text messages.
Exactly. But by pairing that emotional realization with the physical reality of standing alone on a shale-covered ridge, She elevated a bad date to a fight for survival.
She totally did. She took the concept of he's just not that into you and translated it into he is entirely indifferent to whether I survive this afternoon.
It was terrifying.
And the internet agreed because the video racked up millions of views almost overnight. But what I found incredibly revealing in our notes was the bifurcation of the comment section.
Oh, the audience split.
Yeah, they split into two completely different camps.
And that reaction perfectly illustrates how differently we process vulnerability online.
Half of the audience treated it purely as relationship trauma. They were offering solidarity, writing things like, "You deserve so much better, girl."
Treating it like an extreme version of being stood up at a coffee shop.
Right. But the other half of the commenters bypassed the emotional betrayal entirely. They went straight to a true crime investigation.
That second group recognized the physical stakes. They weren't looking at a toxic boyfriend. They were looking at a potential suspect who had failed to complete a crime.
Which makes sense, because we consume so much true crime media as a society.
We do. A large portion of the population is primed to view any suspicious behavior in an isolated setting through the lens of potential homicide.
And the crazy thing is, those commenters who cried murder, they weren't just being paranoid keyboard detectives.
No, what are they?
While TikTok was debating relationship red flags, actual courts were actively prosecuting this exact scenario.
Right. The line between a toxic dating metaphor and real-world legal jeopardy had completely vanished by this point.
And this is where we see a significant organic linguistic shift in the sources. Right?
Yes. The internet basically began to course-correct its own euphemism. Users started dropping the word divorce and replacing it with alpine murder.
Alpine murder. Wow.
Yeah, they recognized that the Trojan horse had done its job getting past the filters, but the reality of the situation demanded a much harsher vocabulary.
They stopped commenting on dating videos and started leaving the term alpine murder under true crime clips and actual courtroom footage.
Exactly.
And our deep dive provides two really harrowing case studies that cement why this linguistic shift was necessary.
These cases are tough to hear.
Yeah, they really are. The first takes us to Austria in 2025, involving a mountaineer identified as Thomas P.
In the Austrian case, strips away any romanticized notion of a dramatic parting of ways. It forces us to look at the cold, hard mechanics of wilderness survival.
Because Thomas P. was on a high-altitude mountain hike with his girlfriend, and the conditions were brutal.
Dropping temperatures, exhaustion setting in.
Right, and he leaves her behind. His defense in court was that he panicked and went to get help, but the result of his abandonment was her death from exposure.
And the legal challenge in a case like that is monumental. I mean, how do you prove malicious intent when the elements, the cold, the wind, the altitude, did the actual killing?
Right. The wilderness provides this built-in plausible deniability. You can argue incompetence or panic or disorientation.
But the prosecution secured a conviction by focusing on the action of abandonment itself. Leaving a vulnerable person in an environment where survival is not guaranteed is a legal choice.
Regardless of whether you physically laid a hand on them.
Exactly.
It is weaponizing the environment. And it doesn't stop in Austria. The deep dive brings up a second case that just hit the news in March of 2026.
Right, shifting the geography entirely.
Yeah, this happened in Hawaii. It involves a doctor accused of attempting to murder his wife. And the location is key here because it happened on the Palipuka Trail.
For context for you listening, Palipuka is not a casual nature walk. It is a ridge trail notorious for severe sheer drop-offs and unpredictable high-velocity winds.
It is an environment where a single misstep can be instantly fatal.
Right.
And the accusation against the doctor isn't just passive abandonment like the Austrian case. He is accused of actively attempting to push his wife off that sheer drop.
Which takes the abstract fear we saw in the Robert Barr story from 1893.
The plotting husband utilizing a sheer cliff.
Exactly. It takes that and drops it directly into a modern indictment.
These two cases, Austria in 2025 and Hawaii in 2026, they provide a really grim, factual anchor to the viral anxiety.
They do. They demonstrate that the fear driving millions of views on a TikTok video isn't just some overactive imagination fueled by algorithms.
Right. The Alpine divorce is a documented, repeating pattern of behavior.
The environment changes, from the freezing Austrian Alps to a wind-battered ridge in Hawaii, but the core methodology of utilizing isolation as a weapon remains absolutely identical.
It really makes you reevaluate the entire concept of true crime. We are so used to looking for complex motives, forensic evidence, elaborate cover-ups.
But these cases show that sometimes the weapon is just geography.
And the method is simply walking away.
It forces a necessary reevaluation of how we categorize domestic abuse.
Yeah.
The term alpine divorce was born out of an internet culture that relies on aesthetic, softened language to discuss trauma. But when a metaphor becomes a literal crime scene, clinging to that softened language becomes incredibly dangerous. It obscures the reality of the threat.
And we have traveled a bizarre and dark path today.
We really have.
We started with a 19th century Gothic revenge plot, tracked how the core anxiety of that story survived to become a viral, algorithm-friendly hashtag in 2026.
And finally landed in the grim reality of international courtrooms, where the wilderness is used as an accomplice to murder.
So what is the overarching takeaway for you listening from all this material?
I think it's the absolute necessity of interrogating the language we consume online. The internet excels at packaging genuine danger into quirky, consumable trends.
It really does.
We all have a responsibility to look past the algorithmic sugarcoating and recognize when a catchy buzzword is actually masking a severe physical threat.
Yeah, it really highlights the friction between the aesthetic curation of our digital lives and the raw, unfiltered reality of physical survival. We started this deep dive exploring the cognitive dissonance of scrolling through relationship advice and stumbling onto a term for lethal wilderness abandonment.
Right.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If we are currently at a point where society is willing to categorize potentially fatal isolation under the umbrella of a catchy, cute dating buzzword, what other serious real-world warning signs are we currently dismissing as just another toxic dating trend to scroll past? Next time you are swiping through your feed, pay close attention to the reality hiding just beneath the words.